And have you been in receipt of a fine from the taxman, or indeed the taxwoman? Because the number of freelancers and landlords fined for careless mistakes spiked last year. As it is reported, the tax office tried to close a £32 billion, just imagine that on your kitchen table, £32 billion tax gap. To help us with this story, let's bring into the conversation Keith Gordon, who is a tax barrister. He's at Temple Tax Chambers, joins me now. How does HMRC decide whether or not fines are to be levied? Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. I'm good to speak to you again. HMRC has legislation that says if a taxpayer has made a mistake in his, her or its tax return, and that is down to carelessness or deliberate conduct, then they may issue a penalty. And the legislation specifies percentages depending on how serious the error is.
Are you allowed one mistake, or does it depend on the size of the mistake? What sort of case can you put up, Keith?
Strictly speaking, you could. It doesn't matter whether you make one mistake or 10 mistakes. It doesn't matter how big they are. However, in practice, if you've missed out 50p of bank interest, they're not going to issue you with an assessment or penalty assessment for a percentage of the 50p that you or the 20p that you've underpaid. So at the end of the day, some common sense applies. But at the end of the day, it's not every mistake gets a penalty. If you can show that you have taken reasonable care, then you are not liable for penalty, full stop. Even if you accept that you have been careless and then can get a penalty of up to 30%, and there are various discounts that you can get, you are still entitled to ask for HMRC to suspend that penalty so that you can put in measures over the next 2 years to avoid a penalty being incurred. So penalties should not usually be incurred except in the most serious cases.
As a professional in the field, Keith, then, what do you take from these numbers? The number of penalties issued 2020 through 2021, 49,701, and 2021 through 2022, just nudging 90,000. It's not quite double, but it's getting on for it. Why? What do you take from that?
I think that the question I would ask is, well, what was the figure for the year before? Because the fact that penalties doubled between lockdown year and first year post-lockdown makes me wonder, well, most civil servants were taken on to other duties, handing out money in COVID loans, etc. They weren't able to, revenue wasn't acting at full throttle in the first year of lockdown. And therefore, it could just simply be, rather than spiking in year two, they've just gone back to pre-pandemic levels. I don't know. I haven't seen the figures, but the article itself raises those questions in my mind.
The legal firm Pinsent Masons filed the FOI that's brought out this information, and they point to this. Is it fair to perhaps suggest that in some instances during lockdown, it's very difficult for freelancers, for landlords and others to physically get receipts or whatever it might be when businesses were effectively put in deep freeze?
That's a possible explanation. I don't think that would explain the doubling in the sense, because most people will have access to their records, and most tax advisors, most accountants were working to the best of their ability during lockdown. And if the worst comes to the worst, that someone was just a bit behind because of family issues, then they would have been allowed some leeway in putting in their tax returns late. It might be that people were cutting corners and not paying for professional advisors and trying to do it themselves and got themselves into difficulty. That I can certainly sympathise with. But I don't think those raw statistics on their own can give you any information other than speculate as to what the background causes.
Again, okay, lastly, Keith, again to you as a professional in the field, the tax gap, the difference between the amount of tax that should be paid against the amount of tax it actually is, stands at £32 billion. Now, I need context for that. Does that shock you? Do you think it should be half that? Do you think it's probably, we're lucky it's not 10 times that? What do you say to that?
The thing about the tax gap is that it stayed roughly constant over a good number of years. But the one message that you get from government and politicians is we've got to crack down on avoidance. We've got to crack down on avoidance. Most of the tax gap is deliberate attempts to defraud the system. Avoidance is a small fraction of that. It was bigger, but it was never a huge chunk of it. And I think the rhetoric has got to focus on the people who are deliberately trying to play the system rather than punishing people who are making innocent mistakes.
Keith, thanks as ever for all your help in this field. Keith Gordon is a tax barrister. He's been found at Temple Tax